One, welcome everyone to this live session in which every Friday I tell you what has happened with the news. What are the things that you need to know about, and as you know, all of this news we always publish in our newsletter. You can sign up to our newsletters at attainsights.com, or you can simply sign up for our page in Insights, and we'll send you a newsletter every week. And what we do is, one week we do the newsletter in English, the next week we do it in Spanish. This is our third week that we're doing this in English, so welcome to this one. And today I want to talk to you about an issue that is like literally the number one issue in the news, which is what has happened to the carbon border adjustment mechanism. What are the reactions to it, and what is being done from other countries in terms of reducing the carbon footprint and CO2 emissions, because it's a very interesting topic. Yes, it is a little bit high level and policy for people who like us are in renewable energy, but it's one of the key and the basis for all that we do and for our competitiveness. I like to start a little bit talking about the tragedy of the commons, which is actually in economic science. The tragedy of the commons is what happens when an individual interest kind of works against the common interest in a particular good or a particular service. So what this means is, like, when there is something that you cannot stop anyone from using, and it's in the best interest of each individual to use as much as possible of that, but in the interest of the common group to use not to use as much as possible. So in the case of fisheries, forests, and of course also CO2 emissions, what you have is a situation where the more that an individual uses that service, the better off for themselves, because they're competing with the others, and abating that. So using less really only hurts themselves, at least in the short term. But if everyone starts kind of competing and racing to use as much as possible, so think fisheries, forests, or especially CO2, then what happens is that the situation is worse off for everyone, like is the case of climate change. And this is a situation that has happened with many, many economic issues for many, many years. A lot of economists has devoted a lot of time to try and resolve this issue, and it hasn't really been so easy. In fact, I know that there is Elinor Ostrom, who is one of the economists that actually won a Nobel Prize on these topics, and who has managed, to move the science a little bit forward, but we're not there yet. And this is why these current carbon pricing mechanisms is such a new science that we don't know a lot about, and is one of the biggest challenge of all times that we have, and we don't really necessarily have the tools that we know will work for this. So I think it was Nicholas Stern that once said that climate change is the greatest market failure the world has ever seen, and in one way it can be understood as a market failure, because you have this issue with the tragedy of the commons, and one of the ways to solve the tragedy of the commons is to price it and to put a market around an item, if you can, when you can, which is not easy, because we don't have one government, we have hundreds of governments around the world, and everyone has to be in agreement, which is extremely hard. And then, of course, each country starts justifying their own use of that good with the drop in the bucket, right? Mine is a drop in the bucket, and everyone justifies whichever way. Per inhabitant, my CO2 emissions are really low, and then what we have is actually that even though that could be correct, you're still in aggregate emitting a lot of CO2. So anyway, very, very complicated issue to solve. And the European Union, a number of years back, they did a trading scheme, and their idea was, to actually put a price on CO2 within the European Union. But they found really, really quickly, of course, that it was very easy to just move production elsewhere. And then what you were doing is actually becoming, making certain companies in your own continent become not so competitive. And actually you were just moving the CO2 emissions elsewhere. And many times you were actually making them worse off, because the matrices of those countries where they were moving to, it was even worse than the electricity matrix of your country. So actually, without wanting to, they necessarily soon found that this situation could worsen off. So it was a flawed system. It always had a target on its back. And the new proposal under Fit for 55 is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the CBAM, which is being presented as part of the Fit for 55 package a couple of weeks ago. And in this mechanism, what it says is you have to pay for the CO2 that you emit, especially if you're a very high emitter. So you are creating chemicals and cement and the like and steel, but also any goods that come into the European Union that are not produced with that level of abatement of CO2 emissions, those will have to pay for those emissions so that you're in a level playing field. So now, why has the EU done that? Well, the EU is hoping that the individual countries start to realize that there is really no point to have their companies come into the European markets and pay a price for CO2 here, which we will keep, when they could easily do it in their own country and keep the money at whichever price they want. So again, there is a market symmetry here, right? Because not all the countries are going to charge the same for CO2. But the European Union is hoping that at least that movement will start to get governments towards regulating and having a real price with real consequences that gets companies to say, okay, it's worth for me to invest in in innovation, in new technologies, in a more productive way to produce without emitting so much. And it's plagued with issues, as you can see, because you still have this issue of companies probably maybe going to governments where the CO2 emissions are cheap. I assume that over time, because it's not clear how this will work exactly, what will be the triggers, how it will be policed, but I am sure that within time, the little loopholes that start appearing in this very flawed market will be worked out. But essentially, at the very beginning, at least, the idea is that it starts taking countries into regulating the carbon. So, of course, here I want to tell you about the reactions, because immediately, Australia is crying like, oh my God, what is going to happen to us? Even though Australia seems like there is not that much really that is going to affect them, because there is not that many products that are heavy in CO2 emissions that come into the EU. But their main client, which is China, is the biggest country that is in that situation where they could be really severely affected, and they will be really severely affected. So for them, it's an indirect matter. And India starts claiming, and other countries all come out and say, "Oh, this goes against WTO rules." In the WTO, what you have to say is that everyone comes into my country with the same rules. That is essentially there is a level playing field, so they can compete. Yes, you can put tariffs for whatever you want that comes into the country, but the tariffs have to be the same for all of the WTO members, essentially. So there is an issue there. Because there is an asymmetry on how much you're going to charge depending on what has been done in the matrix in that country, in the CO2 that company is producing in that country. So I'm not really sure, because I don't understand enough, and I think we'll have to go to a very specific level to really understand whether this contravenes the WTO. Certainly, the IMF doesn't think so. They have proposed other alternatives of how this issue of the tragedy of the commons with CO2 could be bridged, but it isn't easy. Is CBAM the right question? Probably isn't. Maybe it's a step forward in the right direction. The mechanisms that the IMF proposed that had more of an international chain to it, but each country could choose the price of CO2 depending on the wealth of the country. Is that the right thing to do? I'm not sure. You also have to have hundreds of countries that agree. And of course, there is the situation that if 1, 2, 10 countries don't want to, and they actually, all of the work that others are doing, is going to affect them just the same. So there is a number of issues. You need to make it extremely unattractive to go down the CO2 route, and much cheaper to go down the other route. And China, which is like the biggest vocal, very quickly, the EU diplomat came out saying that is very anti-competition, it's terrible for business, we're all going to be worse off. And they themselves have presented their own CO2 policy, very long way coming, and they have plans, to get to peak emissions by 2030 and then zero emissions by 2060. And this may seem amazing. I mean, it's a huge country right now, is number one, but by far, I mean, it's twice as much CO2 as the US, which is the second biggest emitter. And they are industrializing at a very rapid stage, and they are building coal plants like there is no tomorrow. And their mechanism, I am not, of course, a specialist, but it seems to me, like studying it a little bit, that long term, could probably work. It could be quite incisive, but for the next 5 to 10 years, it's like meh. Why? Well, because essentially, first of all, they've already said we're going to continue growing until 2030. But at what rate, China, are you going to be going in CO2 emissions? Because we cannot afford for you to go up that much up until 2030, because you could single-handedly, if you go up enough, like dissipate all of the effort that everyone else is doing. And to 2030 is a big difference. In fact, you will completely obliterate our goal, the 1.5 degrees. I'm not saying this. John Kerry, which is the US climate envoy, said that, that they need to be a lot more, they need to go a lot faster. They need to increase the speed and depth, because, it's essentially impossible with those plans. But also the CO2 plans are very much in line with that. They're like, okay, so we're not going to ask you is that you are going to emit less CO2 per product you produce or per energy you produce. So I want you to be more efficient for the CO2 that you emit, which is good. But if you are producing more energy, more products, you're still emitting more, essentially. You're not changing the overall game, is what I'm telling you. Like, each player does less, but then in the aggregate still really large. So anyway, I think this is right now a very interesting topic to watch, because the US and other countries have already said that they would look into something like the CBAM. They would look into something that actively makes countries think about their own adjustment mechanisms. And, honestly, is really one of the situations where when the dominoes goes, usually they all fall, because it's also in the best interest to do so. In fact, the press in Australia is saying, we missed the boat. Now the Europe has done that, and now we're behind. We could have done this 2 years ago, and we missed the boat because now the money goes to Europe instead of going to our own government. I know. So everyone is kind of moving and starting talking, but also finger pointing. So there is still a lot of things that need to be resolved. So for me, I hope that this next COP in Glasgow helps get to an agreement of what we need to do, because the one thing that you need is agreement from the majority of nations that we're going in this direction. And yes, it's unfair. And yes, it's unfair after a pandemic, what you're changing essentially the rules, and some countries are not going to have time to adjust, even though the CBAM, still works in a few years. It doesn't go into action straight away. I think of countries in the north of Europe, for example, that are going to have to adjust really quickly, and after a pandemic, with their economies hit by the pandemic, and still, not enough vaccines, the lot. But we don't have time. This is the thing. The tragedy of the commons is well upon us. We've already gone through the quota that everyone had and more, and and the CO2 emissions are starting to sharply increase to a level that, if we keep going, certainly peaking at 2030 is not an option. So yeah, this is the news for today, that the main news that I wanted to talk to you about, but there is other as well, that you can read in there. And yes, I again, I encourage you to join our newsletter. We send one, as I said, every other week, one in Spanish, one in English, depending on the week, and we also send them through LinkedIn. So we'll make sure to put a link to the LinkedIn newsletter so that you can sign up. And thank you very much for following us.